From what you can wear to when it's okay to take someone's life, all the way to who has a right to be a citizen. We've got some weird and wacky facts of the past lined up for you as we cover part 2 of the top 10 ancient laws that make no sense. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have a suit of armor. Okay, so imagine this. You're on your trip to London. You're ready to visit Parliament. It's the moment you've waited for your whole life, and of course you brought your very best suit of armor. You're dressed to the nines. You're fully protected. You're ready. Well, have I got bad news for you? No armor allowed. Yeah, this is a law that made a lot more sense at the time it was created, and the weird part is that it still exists and has never been repealed. By 1313, Edward II had upset so many nobles that he became worried about the prospect of an armed rebellion and wasn't feeling safe enough in Parliament. This led to a statute that claimed that every man shall come to Parliament without all force and armor, and those who didn't abide by this rule would be punished. Since then, no one has thought to change it, and I guess while no weapons still makes a lot of sense, the whole armor thing is simply just because it isn't as popular now as it was then. Who would have thought? In our number 9 spot today, we have magic crops. Many ancient laws are extremely specific, and so much so that they come with a specific punishment to fit the crime. I mean, we have some guidelines around sentencing and stuff, so it's not that weird, right? Well, I mean, it really comes down to what the law is asking, you know? Like, for example, this ancient law comes from the Law of 12 Tables, and it has to do with crops. Basically, the law states that the crime of using magic on crops was punishable by death, this time in the form of crucifixion. Like, please no one tell the ancient Romans about Monsanto, they'll be so angry. I so badly wish I could know what, at the time, was looked on as magic on crops. Some guy with a green thumb is getting accused of witchcraft. Also, how serious of a punishment? Imagine just making more corn for everyone and suddenly you have to be put to death in one of the worst ways? I don't know, this one seems a little extreme, but almost everything was in ancient times, I'm beginning to think. In our number 8 spot today, we have butt naked. This is a law that was first enacted in 1463 and was repealed in 1604, and it has to do with some middle-aged fashion. Basically, from 1337 onwards, laws began to be passed that were meant to preserve decency, as well as sort of govern people from dressing above their rank. I mean, God forbid someone wear one too many frills. At this time, however, men's fashion was getting a little out of hand, and people were worried about the immoral way it was going. In 1463, a statute was passed that claimed that, quote, no person under the rank of lord was to wear any gown, jacket, or coat which does not cover the genitals and buttocks. Listen, this is a law that absolutely makes sense, it's just absolutely hilarious. I mean, the part that doesn't make sense is that lords or anyone above were just free to roam around with all of their bits and pieces hanging out no problem. It's truly so funny. I wish I could pay money to sit in on the announcement of this law though. Just some sad guy walking home to go put pants on. It's like, but my little butt. In our number 7 spot today, we have the right to citizenship. This is a law that was seen in a lot of different societies throughout the ages in some ways or others, and in fact was even seen in our own modern society until about a century ago. Basically, this began in ancient Greece, and it has to do with women not being allowed to be citizens. Athenian democracy was only available to adult males, and women were left out of it all. Women were referred to as an aste, which meant a woman belonging to the city. In fact, there was a time where, since there was no registration of women, that witnesses would have to testify in court cases to prove that women were the wives of Athenian men. Women had to work at home and were considered second-rate humans, subservient to her male guardian, whether that be her father or husband. This was all justified by the men at the time because it was actually believed that women weren't as intellectually capable as men, and because it was believed that women had a higher sex drive, and consequently, if given free range to engage in society, would be more promiscuous. Basically, they were just insecure and felt that if women had free range, then they would go out and cheat on them, so instead they just really didn't let them participate in society. Of course, it wasn't just a century ago when women got the right to be citizens, but it was just over a century ago that in our modern society we got the right to vote. It's crazy to see how much things have changed and how some other things took quite some time. In our number 6 spot today we have dinner time. This is a law that was first enacted in 1336. It's definitely not the oldest law on this list, but it is one that really shows what things were like at the time. So many of us have heard and learned about the over-the-top extravagance and indulgence that happened at medieval feasts, and this led to, in 1309, a proclamation by Edward II where he began criticizing the outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and other dishes that the nobles were eating. Later, in 1336, there was a statute by Edward III where he too described his unhappiness with the quote, many mischiefs caused by the quote, many sorts of costly meats which people of this realm have used. This statute, however, set out to do something about this overindulgence, and they tackled that by ruling that no man, of whatever rank he be, shall be served a meal with more than 2 courses, except for at certain festivals, such as Christmas, on which 3 courses were allowed. So basically they made a law that banned having more than 2 courses for dinner unless it was a special occasion. I can't imagine the government policing my food consumption. What makes it even funnier is that while these laws are believed to have perhaps influenced behavior, there is no evidence of it actually ever being enforced. So they made the rule to make them feel better basically, and it lasted for quite a while until 1865 when it was repealed. In our number 5 spot today we have family crimes. This is a law that is truthfully kind of similar to one that we talked about in part 1, but this one comes from ancient Egyptian law. It seems as though much of Egyptian law was based on a common sense of right and wrong, following the codes based on the concept of ma'at. Ma'at represented justice, truth, order, and balance, and basically this concept meant that everyone, with the exception of slaves, should be treated as equals under law, regardless of wealth or social position. If we removed slaves from the equation, this is of course not too far off from our current ideals and the current concept we strive to have within our legal system. The huge difference, however, is that when time for punishment came, it wasn't done to just the person who committed the crime. The consequences were for them and their entire family. If a person was exiled, their entire family would be along with them. If a relative faulted on some kind of labor demand or other service, the entire family might be imprisoned. I'm just saying, Uncle Gary and Aunt Lisa really could have messed things up for you big time. Like, I would not trust my extended family with my legal fate. Not a chance. In our number 4 spot today we have fancy footwear. This is another one of those middle-aged laws that has to do with men's fashion, and this time, everyone's butts are away. This one has to do with men's footwear. Shoes with long pointy ends called krakows or pikes were all the rage back then in the 15th century. Like, I'm talking so much so that the points were getting so long and so out of hand that they were having to be tied around the wearer's ankles or the backs of their knees. It was truly and utterly ridiculous. That same 1463 statute that dealt with everyone's butts, yeah, it also had a part to deal with the shoes, because if everyone is tying up their long shoes behind their knees, how are we supposed to know who the fancy ones are? This law stated that, quote, no knight under the rank of a lord, esquire, or gentleman, nor any other person shall wear any shoes or boots having spikes or points which exceed the length of 2 inches. Punishments for not following this one was a fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence, which is just over £100 by today's standards. I think this law makes no sense because no one should be allowed to have shoes that long, lord or not. In our number 3 spot today we have revenge. The Times of Vikings was certainly an interesting and exciting one, and while many see movies that portray the time and think that Vikings lived in a lawless, almost cavemen-like society, that actually couldn't be further from the truth. While we may not want to take up some of the laws that they lived by, they did have their own codes and laws, and we'll talk about a couple of the weirder ones today. Like this one. Vikings were expected to take revenge as described by the Glotting Code. This was written in the 1000s and is actually the oldest known body of laws in the Nordic countries. So basically, if someone did you some sort of injustice, whether it was violence or insults, you could request financial compensation. I would have been bleeding my childhood bullies dry. However, if you didn't defend yourself, there was a limit to what you could request. You were fully expected to take matters into your own hands if someone wronged you, and if you didn't, this meant that you might be giving up your right to financial compensation. In our number 2 spot today, we have the barber. Okay, so this is a law that has to do with slaves. It's an unfortunate part of history, and it's also important to remember that it still does exist in some places. This law, in terms of a society that has slaves, I suppose makes sense. It is just bizarre, however, because the punishment for this is unbelievably extreme. This law is one that comes from the Code of Hammurabi, and during this time, many of the slaves were actually former prisoners of war and their families who were then forcefully inducted into this new Babylonian society. This law basically states that if a barber, without the knowledge of his master, cut the sign of a slave on a slave not to be sold, the hands of the barber will be cut off. How extreme is that? The punishment is so severe, it makes you think that they almost cared about the slaves, but sadly, of course, that wasn't true at all. It was more so looked at as a very serious and important business venture. So serious that they would chop your hands off. In our number 1 spot today, we have facing the truth. This is a Viking law that has to do with taking someone else's life, so it's a serious one. Well, I mean, it was kind of serious back then. Basically, you could get away with killing someone, but only if you were honest about it. Like today we have different charges for different circumstances. More serious and less serious charges, there's like a ranking, but Vikings of course didn't have these exact same distinctions, and instead it was a matter of honesty and being straightforward. For example, something like arson or taking someone's life at night was actually looked down upon because you surprised them. No one else was around, and you didn't give them a chance to defend themselves. I'm like, okay, I see the point they're making, carry on. This is where things go a little awry by today's standards though. You could kill someone in public without serious consequences because you were doing it publicly, and both the person as well as those around them had a chance to react to it. The only other stipulation is that you took responsibility for it and that you didn't flee. Even if a fight broke out and someone ended up passing away but it was unintentional, as long as you were open and honest, it wasn't considered a serious offense. I guess they were just very forgiving in Viking times. Perhaps in the wrong ways, but who am I to say? Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye!